process for the government. We have been able to have adopted virtually all of our legislation to this point in Parliament. There's a need to refresh legislation.
That's the Prime Minister today defending his decision to prorogue Parliament until at least October. The opposition's not happy about that. How about the official opposition? How do they see this extended break? Is prorogation about resetting the government agenda, as the Prime Minister keeps saying, or is it an attempt to change the channel on the Senate scandal? Joining me now, the leader of the official opposition, the NDP, Thomas Mulcair. Mr. Mulcair, good to have you back on the program.
Nice to be there, Evan. Everything well in Ottawa?
Everything's well. Your reaction to the Prime Minister saying he, as he said, by the way, and signaled back in July, he will now prorogue Parliament, tentative date to come back sometime in October. Your reaction?
Well, he did two things yesterday. Proroguing is part of life in Parliament, but suspending Parliament is not. So saying you want to hit reset, have a new speech from the throne, all part and parcel of parliamentary life. But he's also hiding out. He doesn't want to see Parliament. Don't forget, Stephen Harper only showed up for work 5 times in the last 5 weeks, and he really didn't like the experience because we had some tough questions for him. So now what he's doing is avoiding answering those questions by simply not calling Parliament back. That's where the problem starts. Stephen Harper, this is repeat behavior with him. It's the same thing we saw with Jean Chrétien before that when he was in trouble with the sponsorship scandal. Before that, it was Mulrooney whenever he would get in trouble. So we have a system in Ottawa that allows governments to bring in a new throne speech, to say what their policies and their priorities are. But that's not what he's doing here. He's simply refusing to allow those who have been elected by the public to come back and ask questions of the government to hold it accountable. That's where the problem starts.
Well, he will say, and they've said repeatedly, this is a completely normal tool. You can prorogue. It is normal halfway through the mandate of a majority government to have a reset, and he's doing so. There may be a bit of strategy. He wants to reset to make sure that this last session, kind of before a possible election, he gets it right. What is the problem with that?
We're more than 2 years out from the next election, so in no way, shape, or form is this the last session before the next election. Beyond that, there's nothing wrong with saying you want a throne speech, which means you're starting over in and of itself. But he's doing a lot more than that. He's saying, and with that hand gesture he made, probably October, he's not even ruling out the possibility of coming back in November. He's simply saying the Parliament of Canada won't sit, that he, Stephen Harper, will go into hiding, as he's been doing for months now, to avoid answering the tough questions that we have for him about his role, his personal role in the Senate scandal. He is the person responsible for the Prime Minister's office. That's something that he has to answer for. What happened with Nigel Wright, what happened with Mike Duffy, that was in his office, he's responsible. What happened in the Conservative Party, he's also responsible for. He's the head of the Conservative Party. Remember, they had made an initial offer, the same thing, to Mike Duffy to try to get the scandal off the table. He can't pass this off. But what have we seen over the summer months, Evan? We've seen that most of the people involved in that in his office have been disappeared. They're off to England, they're off to other jobs, they can't be heard from, nobody's hearing from them. Stephen Harper is trying to make himself disappear and saying he'll only be back for Halloween.
All right, let's be frank here. Let's talk about that. Do you think Stephen Harper, let's first talk about the Duffy Wright, do you think he told the truth about who knew what when, in terms of this was just a deal between Nigel Wright and Mike Duffy? Now we've got the RCMP investigation saying other people may have known about some aspects of it, including Woodcock and possibly Perrin, both deny. What's your view on that? Did he tell the truth on that?
Well, it became quite obvious during the course of the summer, in early July, that there were elements to the story where he hadn't been forthright with Canadians. But it's precisely because of elements like that that he has to show up in the House of Commons and answer the hard questions instead of hiding, which he's doing. He lacks the courage to be the Prime Minister, and yet he wants to be the Prime Minister. Well, both go together. You have to be answerable to the Canadian public, you have to show up in Parliament, you have to show up to do your job. Part of your job is providing answers in tough cases like this.
All right, well, the tough words, you say he lacks courage and hasn't told the truth there. Mr. Mulcair, what about the Wallen expense report? It came out last week, it was immediately referred to the RCMP. She called it flawed and unfair. The Prime Minister's on his Arctic tour. He was asked about it yesterday, and he said, quote, "At the time I indicated that all senators' expenses would be subject to robust scrutiny through an audit." Today, he had this to say.
There are rules, and all senators are expected to follow those rules. And Obviously, there's significant evidence that that was not the case, and we expect that we obviously expect that there will be people will be held accountable when rules are not followed.
What's your reaction to what he's now saying about the Wallen probe?
Well, it's rich to hear Stephen Harper talking today about people being accountable. He's hiding out, he won't meet Parliament, and he's saying that other people have to be accountable. Stephen Harper's the Prime Minister of Canada. It's a job that he apparently wanted. Part of that job is answering the tough questions. He should be back in Parliament. With regard to what he said on Pamela Wallin, he's got a very selective memory. I go back to what he said in February in answer to a question from me in the House of Commons. He said that he had reviewed her expenses and they were comparable to the expenses of any other parliamentarians in Ottawa from that part of the country. That's what Stephen Harper said. So there was an important bit of information there. He had personally reviewed her expenses. He had looked at them. How was that? How did he come to have them? Once he had looked at them, he concluded there was supposed to be an investigation going on in the Senate. The Prime Minister of Canada, who's in charge of the Conservative caucus that's in the majority in the Senate, is dictating the results of the investigation. That was extraordinary. Now we've had an independent investigation. Auditors, who are costing more than what Pamela Wallin has to reimburse, have concluded that she cheated in very many different ways and she has to reimburse over $120,000. Now Stephen Harper stands in front of the cameras and says, yeah, people have to be held accountable. Well, if Stephen Harper's a man of his word, he should get back into Parliament. He shouldn't use prorogation as an excuse not to meet with Parliament.
All right, let me do a quick whip around on a couple of issues in the last couple of minutes I've got with you. Prime Minister's in Northwest Territories today. He's on his Arctic tour, his 8th annual Arctic tour. Canadian press reported on Sunday that the government is test driving a $620 million stealth hybrid snowmobile machine for Arctic patrol. They've already been investing $3.1 billion for 3 Arctic patrol ships in 2007, $700 million for the Diefenbaker icebreaker in 2008. So far, we haven't seen any of those, though. What do you make? Good investment, stealth snow machines?
Well, I'd have to know more details about that. The idea of investing more heavily into Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic is a very good one. It would actually be interesting to see Stephen Harper visit the Arctic once in what we call winter. He seems to only get up there when it's warm, when it's the summer. I was up in the Northwest Territories in the middle of winter, and then I went up to Kuujjuaq at the beginning of the summer. I mean, I travel the Arctic as well. The greatest asset we have in the Arctic are its people. There's a lot of resource development being planned for the Arctic. We want it to be sustainable. We don't want the type of mess like the giant gold mine left on the edge of Great Slave Lake in Yellowknife. So let's make sure that we get it right. It's become more expensive up there because Stephen Harper removed an important food program that made life more affordable for people in the Arctic. That's the type of priority that Dennis Bevington and I will continue to work on.
All right. Canadian Medical Association holding their annual general meeting this week. They say it's time to start a conversation about end-of-life euthanasia. Health Minister Rona Ambrose shut the door to that discussion, saying government shouldn't be involved. Should the federal government be more involved in the euthanasia question?
Medical care is first and foremost a provincial jurisdiction, but of course the criminal code in Canada is federal jurisdiction, so both have to work together. Unfortunately, Stephen Harper's government has completely refused to meet with the provinces. That's the type of issue that could be looked at in a joint committee, for example. Quebec's done important work on this. It's got a proposal that's going to be studied. It goes quite far. It's far from unanimous. It's a complex issue, and it's very hard to be rational and emotional at the same time, and it's a very emotional issue. But I think that it's only by doing the hard work, that looking at the best advice from people in the medical sphere and psychology, people who work in long-term care, people who work in palliative care, that you can come to the best result. It's a very tough issue, Evan.
But the feds, you're saying, should be involved in a conversation on it, not shutting the door, or are you saying it's not their jurisdiction?
No, it's part of their jurisdiction. The criminal code is always going to be there, right. So the questions that are going to be asked provincially with regard to the medical side of the care have to be completed with a discussion federally, because if you have someone brushing up against the potential definition of something in that code, that's a federal part of the discussion. That's why you have to work together in a federation. Justin
Trudeau came out last month saying he wants to legalize marijuana. Where do you stand on it?
It's been over 40 years that the NDP has been in favor of decriminalizing marijuana, which means we don't think anybody should go to jail for using marijuana or for possession of small amounts for personal use. But we also know that in the current state of play, what's on the market today compared to what existed 30 years ago is a lot stronger, 30, 40 times stronger. There are people in the field of medicine, in particular in psychiatry, who can tell you that it's having some devastating effects. We want to be careful what signal we send, because if the argument is a catch-all argument that the war on drugs is over and that everything should be allowed, you'll be sending a strong signal that some of the things that are considered recreational, that are not, like ecstasy, which can cause grave psychiatric damage, that they should be allowed. So you have to be careful of what you're doing. It's a complex issue. It has to be brought forward step by step. Our first step is to decriminalize, to make sure people are allowed to make that choice personally. But before you go beyond that, we need a modernized version of Ledane. 40 years ago, Gerald Ledane, who went on to become a Supreme Court Justice, did a magnificent job of defining the limits in non-medical use of drugs. Let's revisit that with today's knowledge and the current state of play with the drugs that are on the market, get the best advice from law enforcement, from medicine, and from the social side, and then we can move forward with it.
Because we're not going to see Parliament for a while, I'm trying to do some rapid-fire questions here with you. I'm not doing a great job on the rapid-fire. Very quickly, if you were Prime Minister, would you deal with the Egyptian situation and the imprisonment of 2 Canadians any differently than the current government?
I must say that John Baird's been doing very well on this one. He's been working closely with the opposition. He's been talking constantly with Paul Dewar, who was on the file right away. Honestly, on this one, I think that the Canadian government is doing a good job. Overall, we should be more engaged in an important country like Egypt. We've seen since the beginning that there are huge problems, but on the specific case of these 2 Canadians, honestly, I think the government's been doing well.
My last question, do you blame the federal government's policies for the tragedy in Lac-Mégantic?
No, I was very careful to make a distinction between our analysis that this system of self-regulation, which has become generalized under the Conservatives. It started under the Liberals, where you asked the food industry to inspect itself. It's this SMS, this self-management system they've got. So they've extended that to a lot of other areas like rail. So the question is, it's like asking students to give themselves a mark on an essay, Evan. You have to have somebody regulating in the public interest, taking care of public security, taking care of security of the environment. That's why you have a government. The Conservatives love being in power. They don't like governing. So this type of regulation, since Reagan Thatcher, they've all said, oh, that's government red tape. Well, it's not red tape. It's public protection, and that's part of the analysis that's going to be on the table anytime you see an abject failure to protect the public like Mégantic. So we've been careful never to say that there's a causal link between the two, but we do want to have that discussion because we think that one of the primary roles of government is to protect the public, and we've seen it in everything from maritime search and rescue to food inspection when we had the largest meat recall in Canadian history, that the Conservatives are not doing the job.
An omnibus conversation with the leader of the official opposition, but the lion's share of it taken up with Tom Mulcair's reaction to Stephen Harper's desire to prorogue Parliament and come back tentatively in October. Tom Mulcair, thanks for being on.
Pleasure, Evan.